This video will introduce how to add an Excel graph into a Word document, like we will be doing many times over the year for lab reports. So you can see data up here that we took in one of our early labs this year with 3 people who were running or walking through the hall, and we were timing them. The analysis section, of course, is where we will insert that graph. So what we have to do is let's first read the instructions. It says construct a graph in Excel that plots all 3 runners' distances versus time. Remember that time is almost always the independent variable, and follow all rules for graphing. And that's important, that independent variable part, because that means that time will be on our x-axis. As we go through, we want to make sure that we add a best fit line to our data, include the formula for each line in our graph. We should plot all 3 runners on the same graph, and then finally, once we're done, we'll copy the graph and paste it into this document. So the first thing I want to do is copy my data, and I'm going to, let's Control-C on that, go into Excel, open up a blank document, and I'm going to paste it here. Now, Excel can be very, very easy to use. If I highlighted these data, went up to Insert, we're always going to use a scatter plot. Now, yours will look just slightly differently. You have a newer version of Excel than I'm using here. But around the middle of the screen in this Insert tab, you'll have charts. And one of those will be scatter. It looks like this. We always want the first option with that. We don't want to include lines at this point. So if we select that, we'll get a graph that looks like this. It's very nice looking, but if we look at it closely, we see along the x-axis here, it goes from 0 to 80. That's our distance. So what Excel does by default is it assumes that our first column here are our x data, and then every column that follows is the y, and it plots it against that x. We don't want that. We want our times to be on the x-axis. So I'm going to delete that and start over. Instead, what I'm going to do is click out here somewhere in the open, away from my data. I don't want to be right next to it because that will confuse Excel again. So I'm going to click over here in the white area. I'm going to go up into Insert and choose that same kind of scatter plot. But now it goes in there and it's blank. I can add my data now quite easily. I'm going to right-click inside this big blank white area and go down to the Select Data option. Now it'll bring up this window. I don't have any data yet, so I want to add one. And I'm going to first name this. So I'll just click in this white area and go select where I want to name it. So I'm just going to name this after our first runner, Carter. Notice how it selected the cell name that I clicked in, which means if I ever change that from Carter to something else, it will also include that change. I'm going to click in my X values now, and the X values, remember, are the time. I want to select the numbers, but not the heading. And it gives me the location of the data that I want to use here. And now finally for my Y data, I have to get rid of this equals 1 in brackets because that's going to plot it differently than what I want. Instead, I want to go back and select the Y values, which will be my distance. And again, I'm just selecting the numbers, not the heading. And you can see behind me now, I've got a nice looking straight line for Carter. Straight because in this case he ran at a constant speed. Now I've got Jacob and Jake both to add as well, so I'm going to do those in the same way. I'll click Add. For series name, I'll select the runner's name. X values are his times. And the Y values, get rid of that and select, in this case, distance again. There's my new one. He didn't go quite as constant a speed, but that's okay. And finally, I'll add for Jake here his X values and the Y values. Okay, so I've got 3 sets of data here, looking good. I want to add now some titles to this. I need a chart title up on top, and I need axis titles or axis labels. Now in your newer version of Excel, if you just select it here, you're going to have a green plus up in this corner. And if you click that, you will be able to see where you can add axis titles and chart titles. I can't do this in my older version. So I have to go up to my Design tab, and this one will add those titles for me. I will properly name each of those. I'll double click so I can get in and start editing this. This was the x-axis is where I put the time. So I'm going to write that, and then remember that I also want to put in parentheses the units that I use, so seconds. The y-axis is the distance that they ran, and the units for that are in meters. So put that in parentheses, and then I want to title my chart, and I want it to be something meaningful so that the reader looking at this, who hasn't watched us do the experiment, will know basically what's going on. So I'm going to say distance versus time measurements for runners for, let's say, a runner, a jogger, and a walker. Okay, now the last thing that this graph is going to need are some best fit curves or lines. These are all linear, so that makes that a little easier. To add a trend line, the best way to do it is to find a data point, and this will be done for one for each runner. Right-click on it, and then go down to Add Trend Line. Okay, now in the newer version of Excel, you'll actually get your options appearing on the right-hand side, but they'll be the same options. In this case, clearly this is a linear graph, so I'm going to choose linear, but you might at some point choose logarithmic or more likely polynomial for physics things. And then down here, I want to also click the display equation on chart, which very nicely gives me that equation. I'm going to move that so I know exactly which line it goes to. And I'm going to repeat that process for each of these. So I'm going to right-click on the next one, Add Trend Line. This is another linear one, and I want to display its equation on the chart. Move that so I know that it goes with my data there. And for my last one, I'll add the trend line and display equation on chart. Just move that so I can read it. This is now a very pretty chart. I know exactly what to do with it. I'm going to copy this chart. I'm going to go back to my Word document. And under here, the last thing, it says copy and paste it into the document below this question. So I'm going to put my cursor down there, just select paste, and there is my chart in all its beautiful glory. And that is how I add a chart into Excel.